Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be continuing our Kant journey talking about section 2 of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Now, in the last video, we tried to explain the basic outline of Kant's moral view, which suggests that moral value is rooted not in the consequences of our actions, but in our intentions, in the principle that it motivates our actions. And we also gave an initial formulation of what Kant calls the supreme law of morality, or the categorical imperative, which is to act in such a way that you could will your maxim become a universal law. Kant regularly in this section is going to return to this formulation and use it to explain why it is that various actions that we think are immoral are in fact immoral. And so basically what we're doing for today is we're building out a little bit more detail of what Kant thinks this moral principle is, what it entails, what makes, Kant has yet to answer in a certain respect the question, why be moral, right? Someone that recognizes, for example, that murder is immoral might say, well, all the worse for morality, right? I'm going to go on and continue murdering. So moral theory, it seems like, needs an explanation as to why that attitude is wrong, or morality would just be a fake thing that, nobody would really be interested in discussing, right? I know that people are well inclined towards the view nowadays that morality is subjective, right? Everyone gets to choose what is right and what is wrong, and, that kind of makes talk about moral rules to some degree superfluous. Now, I think that what Kant is trying to say can actually be more appealing to you than you think, right? Because part of what you might think if you have this sort of view is you might say, okay, well, sure, people have some degree of freedom, and this is important for them to live as human beings, and the fact that we have different customs and different families and all of that kind of stuff, speaks to this kind of difference that we have with one another, right? And that's well taken. That's a well taken point. But we also need to account for, rules that make it even possible for us to live with one another in spite of these differences, right? And so while we might think it's wrong to, impose our own moral views on someone else, and I think that generally there are good reasons for thinking that. At the same time, we want to say that people that commit really, really grievous wrongs weren't just like wrong in some culture or something like that. No, we want to say that that action was wrong in general. Maybe you think it's worthy of punishment, and there should be, political processes in place to control these kinds of behaviors. And so, even though we are inclined to believing that we should kind of give a wide berth to other people, right? We also think that there's something like minimal moral rules that are like totally and absolutely required for living maybe in a democratic society or something like that. And Kant, I think, can speak to those concerns. Kant doesn't think that, morality tells you, for example, how to structure your family or something like that. Or maybe if he did think that, that's not really what his moral view should have said, right? Kant wants to develop his moral theory such that it leaves us some degree of freedom and particularity in how we decide to live our lives and, what it is that we think is right. So, for example, me and my brother might have different, we have different personalities, we have different attitudes, we have different talents, right? And so we each pursue a very different kind of lifestyle, right? He's in business and I teach philosophy. And yet, nevertheless, we both have a kind of shared view about what living a moral life is, right? Trying to help other people, not taking advantage of them, not exploiting other people, but instead working your hardest to ensure that, their freedom can cohere with your freedom. And if Kant is right, this is, the kind of minimal rules, but, general freedom that Kant thinks that his moral theory is appropriate to describe. So with that, let's start getting into some of the important content for this section. Now, I will say, this section is very difficult, right? There's a lot of weird terminology. It's challenging. It's challenging reading. And that's one reason why we were covering this material at the very end of the semester. But if we can get a handle on some basic concepts, then I think that a lot of what Kant has to say will resonate with you, or at least I hope it does. Or you might be able to see it as, more rational than you originally thought it was. And so Kant wants in this section to talk about different kinds of imperatives, right? And an imperative is just like the form that a sentence can take, right? So when you begin a sentence with a verb and you're not asking a question, usually you're giving an imperative, right? Go get the water. Write that down. Listen to me, right? These are all examples of imperatives when we are telling typically someone else to go do something. And obviously, to some degree, morality is about imperatives, right? It's about what kinds of stuff that we should do. And so it's natural for Kant, trying to think about what is morality, what are the bounds of morality. He would start to think about, well, what are different kinds of imperatives? If morality is this process of giving and asking for reasons, at least on some level, right, then we need to examine what the general form of those reasons are. Hence, this analysis of imperatives. And Kant thinks that there are, in general, two species of imperatives. One that he calls a hypothetical imperative, and one that he calls a categorical imperative. It's easier to begin with the hypothetical imperative, right? And so I've listed out 3 examples here, but you could come up with very many more. Example 1 is, if you want to be rich, invest in stocks. Imperative 2 is, if you want to go to Santa Fe, travel north. And imperative 3 says, if you want to be an athlete, train, right? Or you could also say you should train or something. Now, this is kind of a regular way that we talk to each other, right? We're giving each other advice, right? Oh, if you want to be like this, you should do this. And so you might notice several features of all of these imperatives, right? So Kant calls it hypothetical, right? Why does he call it hypothetical? Well, because there's an antecedent and a consequent, which is a way of referring to an if-then statement. So the antecedent is first, right? Antecedent, that kind of just means first, and consequent means it comes from that, right? So in these cases, the antecedent always starts with this if statement. If you want to be rich, do this. If you want to go to Santa Fe, do this. If you want to be an athlete, do this, right? And the consequence holds only in the case that the antecedent holds, right? If you want to be rich, invest. If you want to go to Santa Fe, travel. If you want to be an athlete, train. It's important to recognize that sometimes we mean imperatives that are hypothetical, but really we don't fully articulate the sentence explicitly in this form, right? So like when you're a mom and you say to your child, go clean your room, right? What you're saying is, if you don't want to be disgusting, if you don't want to be weird, if you don't want to have a very dirty room and feel uncomfortable all the time, right, then do this, right? But in these cases, as a mom, you take it for granted that they don't want to have a disgusting room, that they don't want to feel bad all the time, right? And so you just say what is the consequence of the imperative, right? Really, you're stating an if then statement, but you're leaving the if implicit, right? Another thing to note is that sometimes, even in what we've called the antecedent, right, there's more implicit than what is written. So, for example, let's look at number 2. If you want to go to Santa Fe, travel north, right, maybe an assumption that goes into the antecedent there, right, is if you're in Albuquerque or if you're south of Santa Fe, right? And so, oftentimes, right? In the examples, I've made explicit the hypothetical form, but oftentimes the hypothetical form is left implicit because we don't talk to each other like robots and make everything explicitly whenever we talk. But Kant is interested not in what we actually say, but in the principle behind what it is that we're saying, right? Hence, he's looking, as we said last time, for the maxim or the principle underlying the advice that you're giving, right? And so, as a result of this structure, we can see that it only has a kind of limited bindingness, right? So, in other words, the consequent only obtains where the antecedent obtains. If you want to be rich, invest in stocks, right? So, to say that this has limited bindingness is to say not everyone should invest in stocks, right? Investing in stocks is something that's relevant, according to this advice, only on the condition that you want to be rich, right? And so the reason why it's called hypothetical is you have this antecedent that functions as a condition for the consequent, which is the advice, the imperative in this case. And so you can see, right, that therefore these imperatives don't hold for everyone all the time, right, but instead hold under certain conditions that are described by the antecedent, right? And so these always carry an if-then structure, and therefore are in an important way contingent, which means dependent on our interests, right? If I don't want to be rich, then I don't need to invest in stocks. If I don't want to go to Santa Fe, then I shouldn't travel north, at least for this reason. And, if I don't want to be an athlete, then it's not necessary to train. And so we can see that one thing that all of these have in common, I've been repeatedly referring to it as advice, right? And that means that they are providing what we might call prudential reasons. So prudential just comes from the word prudent, which means something like it's a good idea, right? Like you're helping someone be practical. You're helping someone attend to considerations that they need to attend to. So, like, if you want to be rich or you want to be healthy or you want to be happy, blah, 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 right? Here is my advice for you. So Kant's argument essentially is that a lot of the time when we think we're talking about morality, we think we're talking about moral rules. In fact, we're really only talking about prudential rules that are not, at the end of the day, what morality is about. Morality, Kant thinks, is something totally unconditioned. All of these things have conditions, right? And so they cannot be the source of morality's authority. Think about it like this. If morality were a hypothetical imperative, right? And, you framed all moral laws that way. If you want to be moral, don't kill people or whatever. Then somebody could just say, well, I don't care about being moral, right? Why be moral in the first place? And so, if that were true, then morality wouldn't really have any grounding or authority, right? People could just decide they don't want to be moral. But Kant thinks that there's a kind of imperative which speaks not to whatever desires, interests, conditions, etc., you're concerned with in the hypothetical imperatives, but instead obtain for every rational creature whatsoever. And there's actually only one, he thinks, categorical imperative, which is something like be moral. Obviously, you can formulate the categorical imperative as requiring a lot of different kinds of stuff, right? So if you're saying be moral, that involves like not killing people and not lying to people and not exploiting people and not ripping them off and so on. Hence, we've been talking about different formulations of the categorical imperative, right? Different ways we can cash out what Kant thinks is the supreme moral rule that applies to everyone insofar as they're rational, right? And so he's trying to state it's somehow internal to the whole practice of giving and asking for reasons. And so 3 examples of a categorical imperative are thou shalt not kill. So, for example, we don't think of this as, conditioned by your interests, right? We don't find it like acceptable that somebody murders somebody and they're like, well, I didn't want to be a good guy anyway. Right? No, we're still mad at you. We still think that what you did was morally wrong, right? It's not up to you whether it's right or wrong, right? It's not bound by any kind of condition. Killing is wrong. Now, maybe you want to amend this. Maybe instead of kill, you say something like murder. Because murder implies like you're the aggressor and it's not in self-defense and so on. Sure, you can take on that adjustment, right? And so Kant's point is that these are universal moral rules and they don't admit of any exception, right? It's not like you could just decide, well, I don't care about being good, I want to be a murderer, and then we all just have to agree with you. No, we think that this rule still applies to you and you broke it, and so we can hold you responsible for that. Okay, second example of the inflexible moral rule for Kant is never lie. And finally, a third example of a categorical imperative might be something like help others, right? Be helpful to other people, help other people realize their goal. And so it's important to point out, right, the first 2 examples offer prohibitions. They say what you can't do. The third one gives you an obligation. It says something that you must do. And so you might notice the features, in contrast to the hypothetical imperative, right, is that they're simple imperatives. There's no case of an antecedent or a consequent. We don't mean this only in some cases or on some conditions, but we mean it absolutely in general. We will hold you morally responsible for violating them, etc., right? In the same way that I wouldn't hold my friend accountable for not investing in stocks if they didn't want to be rich. And so in contrast to the limited bindingness of the hypothetical imperative, the categorical imperative exhibits a kind of absolute bindingness, because they speak to us not insofar as we have some attitude or quality or characteristic, but insofar as we are rational agents. We can decide what it is that we do, and we have principles motivating our actions. And so if the hypothetical imperative provided a prudential reason for doing something, morality provides moral reasons. You might also say that the hypothetical imperative gives you advice, the categorical imperative gives you laws for your actions. And so briefly, let's discuss Kant's two other formulations of the categorical imperative given in this section. The second one's a quote, the third one is not. In any case, let's go over the quote. Now I say that the human being, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in itself. Let's highlight that, end in itself, and not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. So, in other words, right, I view books and inanimate objects as tools for me to accomplish stuff I want, right? I don't need to think like, does my mouse want to be used today or something like that, right? Because it doesn't have anything like free will. There, it's just a thing out in the world. By contrast, other human beings, they have their own freedom, right? And the freedom that they're acting on is, in an important sense, the same freedom that I'm acting on. And hence, we are both, in a certain way, rational agents. And as rational agents, we make decisions about what's important. And so there's a kind of dignity, Kant thinks, to being a free creature in the world. Kant refers to this status as being an end in itself. So, other human beings are not valuable in the same way that, like, your stocks are valuable, right? They're valuable insofar as they make you money or something like that. But instead, other people are unconditionally valuable, right? Hence, you can never lie to them. When in the example from the last video, I talked about ripping off my rich friend that offers me a loan, right? Well, one way of describing what I'm doing is that I'm not treating him like another rational agent. I'm treating him like a thing that I can use to accomplish my own purposes. And, in that case, he's merely a means to be used by myself, right? That's the description of immoral behavior. And if I were going to treat this friend morally, then I would have to recognize him as, in an important sense, a fellow creature, right? As someone who also makes rational decisions and who things can be better or worse. And then finally, the third formulation of the categorical imperative is this kind of put in a social and political register, that each rational agent is a law-giving member of the kingdom of ends. So in other words, Kant envisions that moral agents create a kind of society that respects morality. And of course, Kant thinks that our world is very, very imperfect, and so we do not fully model this behavior all the time, obviously. But if we were to fully realize our political ambitions, what results is a kind of liberal democracy where each agent recognizes each other agent as a rational creature who can produce certain kinds of obligations for me, right? That's what Kant means by saying that they are a law-giving member of the kingdom of ends. It's because there are other creatures in the world that, act on principles of right and wrong that I can have the obligation to help them. And that they can impose rules and obligations on me, like when we, make promises to one another. And so for Kant, the sort of core of democracy, the core of, liberal political system is that each agent is able to participate not in virtue of your skin color, not in virtue of whatever kind of property you have, right? Not in virtue of being able to pass a citizenship test, but that you are a law-giving member of the kingdom of ends because you are rational, because you act on reasons. Other people can engage in that process with you, and that's what it means to be in a political community for Kant. I very much look forward to hearing what you think. Do you think that these distinctions make sense? Or are they real? What aspects of the material did you struggle with? I very much look forward to hearing what you think in this week's discussion forum. Bye.